All right, we have officially gone live. Good morning, humans of the interwebs. My name is Liana Gillooly, and I'm really pleased to be here with you all today. I just want to start by thanking Chakruna, the entire team, especially Bia Labache, who's put so much energy and effort into curating this event for us. The dialogues yesterday were incredible, and I am really inspired to hear where the conversation within the psychedelic movement is currently. Just to share a little bit about myself, I work for the MAPS organization as a development officer. And why I'm so excited about the panel that we're initiating this morning is because I have a history of working in the cannabis industry and as a cannabis advocate. And I'm just so floored to have the panelists that we've gathered for you all here today to be kicking us off. So I suppose we'll jump right into it. And just so you all know, we are in track 2, Sunday morning. You have arrived. If you're here, you are in the correct place. And the name of this panel is What Lessons Can Psychedelic Advocates Learn from the Cannabis Regulations and Industry? What a timely topic. There is so much energy and activity around policy reform in the psychedelics movement. And there's so much for us to learn from the cannabis policy reform movement. There are a lot of people, I think, who equate the current movement in psychedelics as being highly similar to what happened in cannabis. And our panelists here today are going to enumerate the differences as well as give information about what needs to be considered when writing laws and writing regulations and writing policy reform initiatives. So I am going to begin. The way the format is going to work this morning is that each of our panelists are going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll pull everyone back on together. I prepared just a few questions for the panelists, and then from there, it's going to be all about our audience interaction today. We have extraordinary heavyweights on the call today. It just is, I'm so impressed at the quality of the content that has been pulled together today. I'd like to start off by introducing Dale Gieringer, who has been the state coordinator of California NORML since 1987. That's as long as I've been alive. He is also a member of the National NORML Board of Directors and director of the Drug Policy Forum of California. Dr. Gieringer was one of the original co-authors of California's medical marijuana initiative, Prop 215, and the proponent of Oakland's Measure Z cannabis initiative in 2004. He also has co-sponsored a psychedelic summit to celebrate the 50th anniversary of LSD in 1993 with MAPS and California NORML. So with that, I'd like for all of us to welcome Dr. Dale Gieringer. Take it away.
Thank you. Came here to discuss what we should do to get psychedelics legal. Based on our experience, pretty successful now, with cannabis and marijuana. Let me start off by emphasizing that I don't think that marijuana and psychedelics should be legalized or on the same model. In the case of marijuana, we were able to legalize it along the same lines of alcohol. Marijuana is pretty safe, even for novices. And there's been actually a fairly long tradition of selling marijuana like alcohol in other countries, such as India, before modern prohibition set in. Psychedelics are not in the same category. They need to be treated with more respect. People who come to them the first time should obey be informed of certain cautions and should be prepared, taught about the event. This isn't something that should just be sold over the counter to all adults from the very get-go. So we really need a new paradigm for distributing psychedelics. And I've suggested one like this in the past. It's called drug users clubs. And the idea would be to have nonprofit organizations in charge of manufacturing, distributing, and educating users on the use of psychedelic drugs. These would be nonprofits. They would not be commercial organizations advertising on TV necessarily. They would also be responsible for any harmful effects of the drugs on the users or the members who got them. Now, this whole concept is different than anything we currently have going. It certainly differs from the FDA model for pharmaceutical drugs. And it's not the only model out there. I think we've heard a lot of good ideas elsewhere in this conference of how we should go about making psychedelics available. But we really don't know the details of how that works out. So I would strongly advise the movement in general here at this point to be cautious about overprescribing elaborate regulatory regimes. We did not do that. Starting out with marijuana, we really didn't know the exact details of how marijuana would become legal. We started off with just very general sense of principles that people shouldn't be arrested for possessing or cultivating for personal use marijuana, and left it to the other authorities, the government, to try to fill in the details. And we did that very deliberately because we knew that it would be very, very complicated and involve lots of difficult interactions with federal law if we tried to outlay a whole system of legal distribution and sales and taxation and testing and all of this stuff. Prop 215 was actually a very short initiative. It was like a page at most. And I think we got more bang per word in that initiative than many other subsequent efforts have had, because we didn't try to overprescribe. We let the market, so to speak, develop, subject to this very broad mandate we had, a non-specific mandate about allowing this kind of activity to go on. Let me also emphasize that we started out at the local level. We started out at the local level because we had the most support there. In San Francisco in 1991, Proposition P was put on the ballot by Dennis Perone. And this, like Prop 215 and successor, was just a very general initiative. It just said, we support the medical use of marijuana. And from that, though, Dennis was able to get local support in San Francisco to start up the first medical marijuana buyers club, which operated pretty much publicly, providing marijuana to people who came in with a doctor's recommendation. And the local authorities in San Francisco, already a pretty liberal city, were happy to let that happen. And from Dennis's buyers club, others also started to develop around the same time elsewhere in the country, became a model of experimentation for how marijuana would eventually become totally, well, not totally legal, but under state law legal later on. But it took 20 years to get from Proposition 215 in 1996 to get to our legalized system under Prop 64, which I have to say is overwritten and overly specific. And I think that is something, a trap that we need to avoid. I was looking at the Oregon psilocybin initiative out there, the 71 pages. And in all that 71 pages, you still can't have psilocybin mushrooms in your house or use them outside of one of these special organizations that gets set up under the initiative. Now, when I see a 71-page initiative coming to me about a subject that I'm not terribly familiar with, and most Americans are not terribly familiar with psychedelic drugs, I tend to just vote against it on general principle because you really can't grasp it. So I think it would be wise to step back from trying to spell out a full regulatory regime at any point now, because I don't think any of us know what that should look like. I think we should go back and look at sort of a general broad initiative or law or resolution that embraces the notion that people should be able to use psychedelic drugs for spiritual purposes, medical purposes, and personal illumination in general, but just keep it a broad mandate like that, and then say, as we did in Prop 215, leave it to the state and federal government to fill in the details. As I say, I think we are still at the very beginning, and it is too early to prescribe exhaustive details of exactly how a distribution system should work. Let me say another thing that we have to be mindful of, I think, with psychedelic drugs is there's a lot less familiarity with them than there is with marijuana from the public standpoint. With marijuana, we had like half of the public had tried marijuana. With psychedelic drugs, it's hard to say, but it's more like 10%. And there's a considerable part of the public that is more scared of psychedelic drugs, rightfully so, than marijuana. And you hear this even amongst pro-marijuana people. I know a lot of people who find, you can make marijuana legal. But hey, I know somebody who flipped out real bad on acid, and be careful about those psychedelic drugs. So we need some more public education on that. Now, let me say, when we went into Prop 215, we had a real advantage on the medical issue, and it was a medical initiative. In that poll that we did, a campaign poll, found that 30% of the California public knew somebody who used marijuana for medicine. So right off the bat, we had 30% who knew that the government was wrong. And then, of course, there are their friends whom they might educate, and whom I think did get educated by word of mouth like this. And then there was the additional boost of early on having these buyers clubs established. Dennis Peron's Buyers Club was established in back 1992, like 4 years before we even went to the ballot on medical marijuana. And in those 4 years, by making medical marijuana publicly available and inviting the press in to see all of these patients with all of these different conditions, many of them elderly, clearly in wheelchairs, clearly sick, and benefiting from marijuana for medicine, we had press. Dennis had press coming in from all over the world to the Buyers Club in San Francisco, and that created tremendous good publicity and public education around all of this. Plus, of course, over a period of a few years, it became pretty obvious that Dennis's clubs and the other buyers clubs that started opening up around California were not actually causing civilization to fall apart, that they generated sometimes, sales for the local donut shop, that they could the people could walk in and walk out and, not look crazy or anything else like that. The public became comfortable with the whole notion of public availability, public access to marijuana by having these models around. So I think it is time for us to concentrate on developing these local models leveraging local initiatives that we've had in places like Denver and Oakland, my city, and elsewhere. And take our time about going on to the state level or any further level, trying to, with some broad initiative quite yet. We're going to see some more useful public education materials develop in the next 3 to 5 years as MAPS gets MDMA hopefully approved through the FDA, and then after that, psilocybin is likely. And I think the information that comes out of those research studies is going to, educate the public and make them feel more comfortable with proceeding on this. And finally, just a word. I know that there's a lot of excitement about psilocybin now, and this whole concept of decriminalizing nature is nice. The nice thing about psilocybin in particular is that mushrooms like marijuana are something that you can sort of grow at home or on a small scale basis. Doesn't take them. And people are maybe more comfortable with plant medicine than they are with chemicals like MDMA or LSD. But really, I think we ought to approach this whole issue more broadly and not just do one drug at a time, because then if we have a psilocybin initiative, what are we going to do about peyote? What are we going to do about ayahuasca? What are we going to do about everything else? So I personally would favor a broader approach based on the whole principle of making psychedelics legally available to people who want them on a discrete, personal use, private basis, and letting the rest of the government, and let the government fill in the details. We are at the very beginning of this movement. Let's act locally and think globally, and wait for our eggs to hatch here as more studies come online, become available, and as we have more local examples of real working psychedelic groups. So that's my advice for what it's worth.
Thank you so much, Dale. Your advice is certainly worth a lot around here. And I'm really loving this think globally and act locally, and your vote for small, uncomplicated initiatives that center people gaining direct access to psychedelics themselves before we move into complex regulatory frameworks. Thank you so much for that. So next up, we have Allan Steiner, who has spent 3 years following the 2016 election providing risk assessment to cannabis entrepreneurs, which gave him a unique perspective on what the psychedelic movement might expect moving forward. As an early participant in the decriminalized nature movement, Allan has functioned as a conduit for connection between these two movements. In an effort to further cognitive liberty and physical liberty, Allan aims to empower the psychedelic movement with the policy and regulatory experience of the cannabis industry. Allan, take it away.
Hello, all. My name is Allan Steiner. Like Liana said, I've had the pleasure of being able to speak to a whole lot of people who are interested in trying to start businesses in the cannabis industry. And it's been a really incredible education, finding out, what are the barriers that exist for folks that are trying to get started in the industry. And there's a lot of things that I've found myself telling entrepreneurs in regards to thinking about what it looks like to actually start a cannabis business, because I think that a lot of people lose that. So I want to talk a little bit on the point that Dale was making about staying local. About drug policy happens in a patchwork, because the framework to do like one big national thing doesn't really exist outside of the type of work that MAPS is doing with FDA trials. so much really depends on the local level. And it's hard to give a specific introduction to exactly how you go about moving through your local level. So the recommendation that I make to people is get to know what's happening at your local level. Go to your city council meetings. It doesn't have to be about psychedelics, but just get to know how things flow. Get to know how the process works, so that when you're coming through and you have the point that you're trying to make, and you're trying to make your point, you already have a sense of who your city council representatives are, who represents you. And then once you understand your city level, then you can go up to sort of your county level and your state level, and really understanding those things. But having those very basic building blocks is so important. I see somebody talking about Canada, and Canada also looks very different. So this is why I sort of say, like, really look at what's happened, and looking at cannabis is a good way to see what those mechanisms have been. And there's a good way to find people who already are familiar with those mechanisms. The other point that I wanted to make is that there's a lot of cannabis movement people that are very much on the side of psychedelics, but who don't have the time or the ability to be in conferences like these because they're trying to survive. And so I really want to urge people in the psychedelic space to reach out to people in the cannabis space and ask for the help that you need. Because right now, I mean, just in California, like, the tax bills are coming in and people are trying to deal with that. There's the issue of, trying to exist as an essential business, but not having any of the federal, sort of help and assistance that the cannabis businesses are needing. All of these things. I'm going to run down. I have a list of a bunch of things that I want to mention, so I'm just going to run through some of these really quick. Some recommendations. Find a source of news that you can read every day, and I recommend looking like including cannabis news in that process. There's a really great resource in Marijuana Moment, and I can post this link in the chat real quick. Marijuana Moment is a daily newsletter that covers basically all of the shifts in policy that are happening around cannabis. And it's a daily newsletter. It's a lot of really good content. And if you're reading that for a couple months, you'll start to get a sense of the flow of how a lot of this policy stuff works if you're not already familiar. And I've also been thinking about this in terms of, like, if you want to find a news source that you actually keep up with. The most important thing is that you keep up with it. The second most important thing is that it's accurate, and the accuracy is still really important. So it's really, really important that you're finding news sources that you're able to keep up with, because all of this stuff changes every day, every week, every month. It looks totally different. If you are not paying attention for a month, you're going to come back and you're going to be like, whoa, there's like a bunch of things that I have to sort of get caught up on. Want to just sort of speak to the fact that there are, there's a lot that we can say about cannabis, sort of as sort of a red flag or a sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of topics like investment and capitalism and some of these other things. But there's also some lessons here that are really powerful examples of the power of people-led movements. And I want to speak to equity, which happened here in Oakland and then has spread over to other states. Compassion programs are another one. I can't tell you how much fighting had to be done in order to allow cannabis businesses to give their product away for free. And it's a handful of people who made that happen. I want to give a shout out to Scott Wiener, who sponsored that bill. And the really incredible thing about this, and the thing that I want to sort of pass to all of you, is that these moves get copied. When you see, because cannabis policy happens in a patchwork, when something really big happens, something really important, other movement people, other activists in other places start to copy that that process, and you start to see it evolve and flow. And one of the really beautiful things about having the patchwork is that there's like one group will start with an idea, and then the next group that has the ability to move forward will take that idea and they'll improve on it a little bit, or they'll see some things. And there's something really beautiful about watching how that flows. Let's see. The other point on that is just like, these things happen really slowly. Like, I know people who work on like 1 or 2 policy issues a year. And that's all that they're able to get done. So really focus on what's really important to you, and focus really hard on that, and find other people who are also invested in doing the same thing, and team up with them. And, you know, these are people who you are going to be working with for very likely decades. Like, we're still very early days in this. And having those people that you can turn to and just like call on the phone, and like, just, you know, when something doesn't pass, or when the governor vetoes something that was set to pass at the very last second, and you just need like a shoulder to cry on, like, having those people is so important to doing movement work. Let's see. I want to also speak to building bridges with conservatives and folks that you might not feel like. The idea of cognitive liberty as a bipartisan issue is really important to sort of understand, and to try to bring in folks that you might not think will agree with you. I think that in talking to people about this issue, I find that's not always the case, and you don't want to build barriers where there don't have to be barriers. That's going to really get in your way from a movement standpoint. Let's see. Wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the way that regulations touch on indigenous tribes. California, for example, offers sovereignty with regards to cannabis to indigenous tribes. That's more than a lot of other states and countries are offering. But it's also, it's not sort of as perfect as you might imagine. I think that sovereignty does this thing where it sort of assumes that the state is in charge of offering sovereignty, as opposed to thinking of sovereignty from a standpoint of, this is somebody who we need to be bringing to the table to figure out what our laws are. And then offering some more of that, but having groups and indigenous groups in particular at the table from the beginning is really, really important. I've got a whole bunch of other things here. I don't know how much time I have. I also just wanted to mention banking is a huge issue for cannabis. It will be a huge issue for psychedelics. And getting smart on this stuff before you start putting your money up, understanding 280E, understanding the challenges that we're dealing with taxes. I was in a call with cannabis businesses that are dealing with COVID-19, and the problem that they're dealing with isn't the sort of social distancing or not being able to have people around. It's that the tax bill is due, and the tax bill is insane. And you know, there's a lot of things that have come up with that, but I think that understanding the tax burden that is on small businesses right now is really important to understanding why cannabis is starting to look the way that it's looking. Let's see. Wanted to talk a little bit about things like, just like extinction events as an idea. We've had a ton of extinction events in the cannabis industry. Some people might remember July 1st when we had to have testing done by a certain date, and there was a lot of product that hadn't been able to get tested because the testing labs were not ready to test until late. And all of these things, the state doesn't have a lot of patience for like allowing for exemptions. So just understanding these things and looking at the history. I'm not tried to give like a full lecture on all of these things in particular, but having a good idea of some of these things. Let's see. Also wanted to talk a little bit about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, just the fact that that exists and has been a burden for cannabis businesses. And also talking just a couple shout outs for Sun and Earth, which is sort of an organic certification for cannabis and recognizing that that exists. Shailene Title in Massachusetts is doing really amazing things. Cat Packer in LA has been doing a lot of really amazing things. And then the one last point I wanted to make is like, I made the point earlier about finding newsletters or things that you can keep up with. I also want to mention podcasts are a really great way to stay in touch, understand what people who are moving through the industry are thinking. And if you're looking for good podcasts, a recommendation that I have is just do a search in your podcast for Steve DeAngelo, and a lot of really good podcasts are going to pop up. And just listen to a bunch of them and see what works. If you're looking for places to get involved in the movement, find your local NORML chapter. NORML is basically everywhere and is a great way to start to just start figuring out who the other people are who are near you, who are invested in cannabis and who know that landscape. And those are going to be really great allies. Whether you're talking about cannabis or you're talking about psychedelics, these are people who understand the challenges and the people who are making moves. And with that, I'll pass it back to Liana.
All right. Thank you so much, Allan. Thank you for highlighting that cannabis policy reform has been a patchwork of different programs and initiatives that have been piloted and tested and iterated upon and then picked up and propagated throughout the country. It's a really important note here as we watch decriminalize nature and some of the state initiatives take form. So next up, we have Steve DeAngelo, and I feel extra excited to introduce Steve because I got to know Steve back when I worked at the ArcView Group, which is the largest network of cannabis investors. Steve founded that organization with Troy Dayton. And a fun fact about Troy is he used to work for MAPS way back in the day in 2010 when I first met him. Steve is globally recognized as a cannabis leader, and he was dubbed the father of the legal industry by former Speaker of the California Assembly, Willie Brown. He's a lifelong activist, author, educator, investor, and entrepreneur. And Steve's prepared to do a little deeper of an introduction of himself. Many of you will know him as a founder of Harborside, which was one of the first 6 dispensaries established here in the United States. And one thing I'm really been paying attention to is Steve's work as founder of the Last Prison Project. And Steve says he will not rest and will not stop until the last cannabis prisoner is free. Steve, take it away.
Liana, thanks so much for the invite and for having me here and for the kind words. And Allan, that was a great summary of some of the issues that the psychedelic movement is going to need to pay attention to, some of the issues that we ran into as we started making cannabis legal that we're still dealing with today. And Dale, I think, made a couple of really good points that I agree with. One is that excuse me, the psychedelic movement being really in its infancy should be creating structures that allow for a multitude of models of how to approach psychedelics to blossom. Should we approach psychedelics as a sacrament or as a therapy? Is it a matter of personal development? Is it something that's more spiritual than that? How should these substances be taught? Who's going to be in charge of those lessons? And so I think that all of those questions need space to develop in. Different models need to be tried out, and the strengths and weaknesses of those models will become apparent as we work through them. One thing that I think I have pretty strong feelings on at this point, I wouldn't say that I'm completely settled in my view, but Dale touched on it, And that's the question of profit making versus nonprofit. And I'm going to drill down a bit deep on that. Let me start just by giving a little bit more on my background. Thank you, Liana. I almost feel like I don't need to do a bio now, but I'll just highlight it a little bit because it will inform my comments. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in a civil rights family and encountered the plant when I was 13. Immediately fell in love with cannabis and knew that it would always be a part of my life. I also knew that it was illegal and I didn't want to be a criminal for the rest of my life. And that led me to becoming an activist at an early age. And that part of my career happened in Washington, D.C. And I really, for the first part of my career, was just a street activist doing smoke-ins in front of the White House, working on getting hemp tour launched and financing the political activities with a fairly extensive underground cannabis dealing and smuggling operation. As time went on, I developed a niche for creating, what we call now socially conscious businesses. We didn't really have a name for it then. The first of those was a hemp company called Ecolution, which I launched in 1990 and spent 10 years in the legal hemp industry. Towards the end of my time in Washington, D.C., I was a lead organizer and fundraiser for D.C.'s version of Prop 215. It was kind of Prop 215 on steroids. It was 2 years later. And we won that election with 69% of the vote. But because the U.S. Congress has ultimate authority in Washington, D.C., they exercised that authority to essentially veto the initiative, and it did not go into effect for 12 years. That was, believe it or not, a shock to me. I didn't think that the U.S. Congress would take an election away from us that we had won with 69% of the vote, and I think that it's something to keep in mind as the psychedelic movement looks forward. So I decided it was time to come to California. That the 25 years of activism I'd spent in D.C. hadn't rewarded me that well with that much progress. And California was very fertile ground for me. As Liana mentioned, I launched Harborside, one of the first 6 licensed dispensaries in the United States. And the idea behind Harborside was to create a gold standard of cannabis retailing, to prove to the world that we could sell cannabis in a way that brought benefits to communities instead of harms. And out of that getting ahead of myself, out of that Harborside experience, a couple of other companies that were critical in the early stages of the legal cannabis industry grew. The first was Steep Hill Laboratory, which was the first dedicated cannabis analytics laboratory. And that was, just grew out of a need we had at Harborside before I opened the dispensary. I called every single analytical laboratory in the Bay Area and asked them to test the cannabis, because if I'm going to give it to people with compromised immune systems, I want to know the weed is clean. They all refused, and so that led to the development of Steep Hill. And as time went on, Harborside, Steep Hill, some of the fights that we got into with the federal government brought a lot of attention on Harborside, and I started being approached by cannabis entrepreneurs and would-be cannabis investors who wanted to figure out how to participate in the industry. And that led to the creation of the ArcView group. And let me just focus on the ArcView group for a minute. When we launched it, it was 2009. Obama had just won the presidency, and we expected that he was going to be favorable to cannabis, certainly more favorable than Bush, who had been conducting raids of dispensaries and sentencing people to ridiculous long sentences on medical cannabis charges. So we thought we had a window of opportunity. We didn't know whether that window would last 4 years or 8 years, but we wanted to make the most of it because we knew, having studied American politics and the swings of the pendulum, that after Obama, we were likely to see something that was uglier rather than more favorable for us. And we started thinking about how can we do that? How can we take this movement? At that time, California was the only place in the country that had a legal cannabis industry of any kind. Colorado had just legalized medical cannabis, but they hadn't really stood up an industry yet. And we felt like we had a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time. And that's when we hit on this idea of using the energy of free enterprise to power this social change that we are after. And the ArcView Group was really a conscious effort to invite the investor class into the cannabis industry, believing that if we did that, that the clout, that the influence, and that the financial resources that they brought could transform the cannabis reform movement. And fast forward to today, 10 years later, más o menos, and most of the United States has a legal cannabis industry of some type. Canada has a completely legal adult use industry with international trade. So does Uruguay. There's numerous other countries around the world that have significantly reformed their laws. And I think a lot of that progress is because we did invite the investor class in. We did unleash the energy of free enterprise to power this change. But it came at a cost. It came at a pretty significant cost. I'm going to focus here, like I said, on the issue of profit making. So, prior to the time that ArcView really started inviting the investor class in, people whose main interest in cannabis was making money, the movement and the industry had been driven mainly by people who had a close personal connection to the plant, who used it in their own lives, who derived value from it, who in some cases viewed it as a sacrament. And the choices that we made about how to talk about the plant, how to explain the plant, the kinds of policies that we were interested in, the kind of models that we built, all came from that basic love of cannabis. And it wasn't the same after we invited the investor class in, after we really started making a big deal about the entrepreneurship opportunities that there were in cannabis. We did what we set out to do. We attracted a lot of people whose motivation in this world is not love of cannabis. It's love of making money and acquiring more money and building wealth. And so I think that for me, anyhow, I expected the energy to come, but I was a little bit taken by surprise by the ferocity and the urgency of it, how much change we saw and how quickly that it happened. And there were parts of it that were very disturbing. I saw a lot of people who had spent their lives dedicated to representing the cannabis plant, who represented it in a very good way, start to lose power, start to lose, in some cases, their livelihood, started to lose influence over the ability of how to tell their story, of how to explain cannabis to the rest of the world. We started seeing bankers coming in, a lot of them from Canada with millions and millions and millions of dollars, hiring marketing companies who unleashed these huge public campaigns, but neither the bankers nor the marketing companies knew that much about cannabis. And so the materials that they've put out, from at least from my activist point of view, have not been helpful, and in many cases have been really counterproductive. We saw a whole range of cannabis companies that had been started by people who have this connection and love of the plant, take investment money and then cede a lot of their control over those businesses to investors who came in with a very different set of values. And their main goal was to make as much money as quickly as they could. And there was a race to the bottom effect that happened when you are a profit-making company. Even if you have been founded on a solid set of values, you have to exist in a competitive marketplace. And if your competitors start deploying a product or a tactic or a strategy that may not be entirely consistent with your values, but starts eating up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of your market, you have to find a way to respond. And very frequently in the new environment, that's meant compromises on some of the legacy values that companies grew up with. So, my fear is that we could see some of the same things happen with psychedelics. I've been, in my travels, get a lot of decks that are presented to me. And lately I've been seeing these very big, ambitious decks for public market psychedelic companies that are going out and pitching to the same base of cannabis investors that blew up the Canadian public markets and then crashed the Canadian public markets. And that's scary to me. I also worry about now if psychedelics follow the same pattern that cannabis has, the way in which these substances are going to be taught to the rest of the world is going to change. The way that we who love these plants and visionary substances might explain them can be different than people whose main motivation is selling as many doses as they can, as quickly as they can, at as high a profit margin as they can. And those folks will use their influence to at least to influence a set of regulations, if not to game them. So, what we could see is the creation of models of psychedelic education, psychedelic experience, psychedelic substances that are more geared to return value to investors than they are to provide a really meaningful experience for the individual, or an experience that's as useful to the social change that I think psychedelics teaches us is necessary. I'm just going to wrap with another concern, which comes out of my personal path with psychedelics. Psychedelics have always been a part of my path. I started with cannabis reform, but expected that I would get to psychedelic reform at some point. So it's good to be here. And what I've learned on that path, many lessons, but one really important one is that intention drives result. The state of mind, the consciousness that we approach anything with is going to have a really profound influence on what happens with that interaction. And I think that on a psychic level, on a cosmic level, that a different vibration is created when psychedelics are advanced around the world, or spread around the world, are evangelized around the world with the motivation of acquiring more money, of acquiring more power, than when they're spread with a motivation of love and of sharing and of bringing about the social change I think that we're all hungry for. So just on a cosmic, psychic, vibrational, energetic level, I feel a lot more comfortable with the idea of psychedelics coming from the hands of people who love them than from the hands of people who love money. And since I'm on cautionary tales here, I'll just leave with one note. I've seen a lot of folks taking advantage of some of the legal reform. And it's really wonderful to see a whole new generations of people who have never had access to visionary plants getting that access. But I want the folks who are doing the hero's work of getting that medicine into the hands of people to be aware of the risk that you're taking, that federal authorities consider psychedelics, even mushrooms, even cactus, in a very, very different category than they do cannabis. And be mindful. In the early days of the cannabis movement, people were arrested who are still in prison to this day. Don't let that happen to you. Be safe and stay free.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that. And thank you for ending with what you just said. I, too, would rather see psychedelics be delivered into our society by people who truly have reverence for and appreciate and respect these medicines and these compounds, rather than people who love money. I think that that is something we can really agree upon here at the Psychedelic Liberty Summit. I think it's safe to say that. So yeah, there's some questions coming in from the audience. There's some just great comments as well from somebody wrote, psychedelics are amplifiers. What are we going to amplify? I love that concept. And it fits in with how Steve just ended. So yeah, I have just a couple of questions prepared, and then we'll dig deep into some of the audience questions. Since we ended with Steve, there's this huge concern around what we can do in psychedelics to prevent big VC moneyed interests coming in and dominating the space. And I know that Dale and others have advocated for really simplified terms, resolutions that aren't extensively long and over prescriptive. Yet I'm wondering, as we go and make these local initiatives, how do we, if we can at all, control whether or not that happens, whether or not big VC interests and the consolidation and concentration of power within a few hands? What can we do to prevent that as a psychedelics movement?
Well, the most effective way to keep the people who really love money out of the industry is to require it to be nonprofit. That's what we did with cannabis. Prop 215 included language which was, I think, accurately interpreted as requiring all cannabis companies to operate on a nonprofit basis. Now, some were more faithful or less faithful to that rule, but just the fact that that rule existed kept the big VC money out. And I think that it would be very effective at doing that with psychedelics as well. So I would certainly advocate that, especially as these early initiatives get rolled out, that to the degree that they choose to address the issue of legal access, that they require that access be provided in a nonprofit fashion, exclusively a nonprofit fashion. There's a larger question here. And again, I just want to be, I'm going to throw up a few yellow flags here and there because I've been hit by the federal truck a few times myself. And to the degree that our initiatives mandate a legal system of distributing a controlled Schedule I substance, we are going to attract a lot more federal attention than if we do, for example, lowest law enforcement priority initiatives. If we do initiatives that will allow a Measure Z club type structure for people to gather together and share information and psychedelic experiences. But once we start talking about legal access, then we can expect more attention from the federal government. I'm not saying we shouldn't go there. Absolutely, we need to go there. But we just need to be mindful of our timing and understand that, with each step forward we take, we may be provoking some pushback, and we need to be strong enough to survive it and push through it.
Thank you. Dale, hold on. I'm going to unmute. You're muted, Dale.
All right.
There we go.
Just following up on Steve's sage comments there. I make the distinction between legal marijuana and legalized marijuana. Prop 215 was a step toward legal marijuana. People could have it, all right. It was not a crime anymore to have marijuana. Legalizing has involved establishing a whole set of government-run institutions, which are in themselves very restrictive and which attract their own swarm of professional consultants and moneymakers and whatnot, and which have, but they did not really get involved in California's industry in any meaningful way until we actually had a legalized system established by the state legislature, and which in fact explicitly embraced for-profit distribution. That's what really changed everything in California. But that first 20 years that we went along without those rules worked very well, was very fruitful. And I would like our psychedelic movement to follow that course at the moment.
Great. Allan, anything to add?
Just that there's a lot of sage advice being given here. I think that the profit piece changes so many things about how business is conducted, and it increases the cost of doing business significantly in ways that I think are hard to predict if you haven't been through it. The sort of first point that I make, and it's really only the first point because there's dozens of examples of the same thing, but I can't tell you how many people I know who have complained about the fact that the rent, if you are found to be starting a cannabis business in the legal market, is $20,000 a month. And you can imagine that, like, during a situation like this, where you have 6 months where you have to pay rent and you might not have anything going on, like that is really detrimental to a small business's ability to survive. And just being aware of the fact that in the name of profit, we are willing to increase the cost of doing business to a point that small businesses can't participate, is a really important lesson to take from the for-profit model that has sort of happened, particularly here in California, but we see the same thing in other states as well.
Thank you. Just to follow up to that as well, there was a talk a little bit earlier about buyers clubs, and I'm wondering if one of you would like to describe how that might look and what that might look like in terms of, for example, here in Oakland, where we have decriminalized nature, how might that take place here? I live here in Oakland, and I know Steve and Allan does as well. So not to be Oakland specific, but I do think that we can model things here and then pass it around. It sounds like Dale has an answer.
No, I just live in Oakland too. I haven't been to any of these clubs here in Oakland, actually. I've been to the old Measure Z marijuana clubs, but not to, which were all sort of in, residential or not obviously commercial, definitely not storefront locations, and certainly we're not advertising in the alternative newspapers or much of anywhere else, but more by word of mouth. And at their shadiest, the Measure Z clubs amounted to somebody with a bag of pot and some scales and a roll of cash. But it worked. So I don't know how the mushrooms are being done. Have any of you fellow Oaklanders seen them?
I've got an answer, and it's partially drawn from the early experiences of what we would call patient collectives under Prop 215, and it's partly drawn, and I think more clearly drawn from the model which has been used for cannabis reform in Spain, which is a model of social associations. And let me just drill down on that one a little bit, because I think it's a very exciting model for psychedelics. And if you go to Spain, there's about 1,000 what we would call dispensaries, but they all have on-site consumption. They all come in different flavors, but they're places that people go and hang out with each other. And sometimes there will be people playing board games. There will be people there coding or doing gaming with each other, or bookshelves, or social occasions. All sorts of things happen there. They serve food. Some of them serve alcohol. And they are built on 3 legal principles, which they have in Spain. One, the legal right to cultivate your own cannabis. 2, the legal right to consume that cannabis. And 3, the legal right to associate with other people who are doing things they have the legal right to do. Now, assume for a moment that a lowest priority initiative in a city like Oakland effectively gives you those first 2 rights. Okay? You effectively have the right to cultivate and consume your own visionary substances. So then you just need to exercise a 3rd right, which is the right to freedom of association. There's clubs that are car clubs. There's painting clubs. There's flower clubs. There's wine clubs. There's all sorts of associations that people form. They have a membership role. They collect dues. They have certain rules, and their members get together and share whatever it is that they're enthusiastic about. So this is a model where we could effectively have access, right? But the access, rather than being mandated in the initiative, just happens naturally because you have associations of aficionados of mushrooms who are getting together, and aficionados do what aficionados do. And so eventually people will work out those access issues, and it's done on a more widely distributed scale that's way less susceptible to federal attack, that I think is politically more palatable for our local jurisdictions to embrace and not actively oppose.
Great. Just a quick follow-up there, too, from the audience, is a question on scalability issues. And if we stand something up here in California that makes having access through psychedelics through nonprofit entities only, what impacts might that have on the ability for there to be increased access to these powerful experiences?
It's a trade-off. Right. I mean, I'm sure that if we welcome VCs in and they, bring hundreds of billions of dollars to the table and stand up these huge companies, they will do what the cannabis industry did and go out and hire people like John Boehner and wield influence, and they may be successful at doing that. So yes, I think that that there's an argument. I'm not sure it's a certainty, but there's an argument to be made that bringing free enterprise and profit making into the psychedelic movement would accelerate it. My experience with cannabis teaches me that acceleration would come at an unacceptable cost.
Mm. Mm. Thank you for that. So just to bring us back a little bit into the policy framework, my question for you all is around, is there anything that was included in any of the statewide initiatives that passed that you thought was really excellent and should be replicated in cannabis? And conversely, was there anything that was included that did not go far enough or had some unintended and unexpected outcomes and unintended consequences that maybe upon retrospection you would have liked to ensure wasn't in there?
There's a long list.
Give us a few of your top ones.
Well, the top one for me is the one that I just mentioned, right? Prop 215 essentially mandated nonprofit distribution to the degree that it mandated distribution. And Prop 64 allowed for-profit distribution. And that led to the most radical change in the California cannabis industry that we've seen in a half a century. And there's a lot of people who are part of the cannabis community who feel those changes have really disrupted a world that functioned very well, that was very beautiful, and has replaced it with a system that's dysfunctional, whose advantages fail to outweigh its disadvantages. Mm. So I think that's the one of the big cautionary tales to be looking at here. I think another thing is to look at scale. I think that to the degree that for-profit opportunities are kept at a lower scale rather than a larger scale. So, one of the big issues in Prop 64 was how large should any single cultivation site be allowed to be, and how many cultivation sites can each individual entity own and operate. And the idea or the desire was to prevent too great an aggregation of production in the hands of just a few companies. I think that when we see that when we think about motivation, it's much more likely that people who really love psychedelics are going to be standing up small companies than are going to be standing up really large companies. So I think something that we might want to look at is some of these kinds of provisions where there would be both production and license limits on any entity that was allowed to produce. You can only produce X number, hundreds of pounds of mushrooms a year. You can only have one cultivation site or two cultivation sites. something like that to, create a bit of a disincentive for the very, very large scaled up corporations to come in.
So that sounds like writing in even more regulations. Dale, what would you have to say to that?
I was going to go back and look at Prop 215, which I'm really glad it got written the way as briefly as it did and was as general as it did. It did turn out in retrospect that there were a couple of omissions on our part. One was, Steve mentioned, and we always assumed that if we made it illegal for people to grow and possess their own, that they ought to be able to associate with other people and, have collective gardens and grow their own and things like that. We thought that sort of followed from general constitutional principles. It didn't really, and caused a lot of early problems with law enforcement until we got a bill out of the legislature, SB 420, that sort of clarified that that was possible. But it would have been good to have the right of association, very simple one-sentence thing inserted. The other error we made had to do with not assuring certain rights, like right to housing and employment and things like that. We thought, with the wording we had, that we were giving the same rights to medical marijuana users that that prescription drug users had. But unfortunately, this went to the courts, and the courts decided, by the way we had written the language, that we didn't make it clear that we were extending that these general rights were to be recognized. They said, "Oh no, this just says that people can grow it and possess it without criminal penalty, but nothing more about whether they can carry it around in their car or whether they can share it or whatnot, and certainly whether they can." Use it and be employed, gainfully employed. So we should have, changed the wording on that. And let me say, doubly unfortunately, the people who wrote Prop 64, I think, Prop 64 was an example of getting too much into the weeds with too many details that were unnecessary. And they went out of their way in Prop 64 to make it clear that there was nothing in Prop 64 that required employers to respect the right of employees to use marijuana at all. They a specific disavowal. That's the kind of stuff that you really want to stay away from when you're writing initiatives. Make sure you've got the rights written in there, and let the lawmakers deal with the specifics.
Yeah, I think there's a cautionary tale also in the process of Prop 64. One of the reasons that Prop 64 is such a disaster is that it's not the Prop 64 we thought we were going to get. There was a group of just about every serious stakeholder in the cannabis community in the state of California that was meeting for well over a year every weekend to work through a draft that we could all agree on. I think you were at some of those sessions, Dale. It was a grueling process, but at the end of that process, we came up with something that we all felt we could live with and back. And the idea was that Sean Parker was supposed to give a $25 million donation to the Drug Policy Alliance. And the Drug Policy Alliance was going to lead the campaign for this draft that we had all developed together. What happened is that Mr. Parker fired DPA and instead took that money and gave it to a political consultant named Gail Kaufman. Yes, she's probably going to hate me forever for this one. And she proceeded to make a whole series of compromises that we never would have made. And so the draft that came out of that Gail Kaufman process was radically altered. And it's just another example of motivation. Gail wanted to impress Sean so that the next time that Sean wanted to run an initiative, he would hire Gail again. So she just cared about getting the initiative passed. She didn't have any particular connection to the plant. And so it just, again, I think highlights the importance of shared consciousness. as we build this movement going forward. And I think especially in the early days of a movement, having that shared consciousness is important, really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. Allan, anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one point that was coming to me earlier is like doing these types of conferences is sort of like the journey, and then what we do with that becomes the integration, and making sure that there's a lot of really good policy that we can think about implementing, but I think one of the morals of this story is like that and what actually ends up happening are two different fights entirely. Recognizing that second fight is the one that actually you have to abide by in law. And so I would say that all of that stuff is very, very resonant, in how we are going to move forward with psychedelic models, is recognizing that there's a lot of people who have done their theses, their graduate thesis on drug policy models and things like this, and recognizing that that's not necessarily the same people who are going to have the money to put forward an initiative or a movement, and being very conscious of that, and recognizing that the work doesn't come from just attending these conferences. That's a really important piece, but actually standing up and doing the work. To try to get the things that you believe in on the table.
Thank you for that. Yeah. It is really, I think, important to highlight that this entire movement requires millions upon millions of dollars to generate and operate and bring these visions forward into the world. And so, while we are talking about a lot of cautionary tales around big money, I think it is important to find a way to invite that energy in. And there's this tension between always with reform movements and policy initiatives, which is the question of what the stakeholders really want to be included in the initiative, and then what everyone collectively feels the public can handle and what will actually pass. And there seems to be this consistent tension. And one thing I want to mention as well is I didn't hear anyone in here talk about the omission of these reform movements to include the letting prisoners for cannabis offenses out of jail. And I was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on that.
Well, for me, and thank you for pointing that out. I feel really remiss that I didn't. For me, it's really simple, right? If we as a society decide that something's not illegal anymore, that it shouldn't be illegal, then you don't keep punishing people for the thing that's not illegal anymore. You let them out. And I would say in the case of cannabis and psychedelics, which never should have been made illegal in the first place, that there's an obligation on the part of society to help these formerly incarcerated, justice-involved individuals to rebuild the lives that were stolen from them. That just seems to be, very basic for me. How could we sit out here doing psychedelics and while our brothers and sisters are sitting in a cell for what? Being brave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve, for all of the work on the Last Prisoner project. And it's been really heartening to see that movement really expanding.
Yeah, it's so important, right? We don't leave our fallen on the battlefield. That's not what any of these substances teach us. Liana, I think that you're really right. The point that you just made in terms of trying to find some way to draw some of this energy in, and the question is how do you draw that capitalist, entrepreneurial investor energy in, and not have it really completely warp what we're doing. And I know that MAPS has done a lot of thinking on that and has developed a really interesting sort of hybrid model. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, sure. And I'm sure I think some of my colleagues have covered it, but to cover it here, so MAPS is a nonprofit that's doing drug development, which is extraordinarily expensive. And so we created a public benefit corporation that is wholly owned by the nonprofit. And the activities of the PBC, we've moved all the research over to the PBC. And we are moving it will be the training of the therapist as well as the production and distribution of the MDMA products that we will be then taking to market will be all activities under the PBC. And the sole beneficiary of any potential profits that PBC generates will go straight back into the mission of the nonprofit, which is to develop safe and legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics. So that goes beyond the medical research that we do as well. So that's the kind of virtuous infinity loop cycle that we're seeking to create here. And also because the work that we do is so cost intensive, we're hoping to not have to constantly, rely on donations to make this work possible in the world, and that we can use the success with MDMA to further the field.
I'm not going to clap and hurt everybody's hands, but bravo. Yeah. I mean, what a great way to think out of the box. And to incorporate some of the power of this energy, and at the same time, you preserve the intention that we're moving forward on. So I'm really excited to see how the MAPS model proves out over time. And it's, I think that's the kind of, we can't on the one hand say, oh no, we can't do anything that looks like profit making. Or we're going to rob ourselves of a lot of energy. On the other hand, I think that all the concerns I raised are real. So well done.
Just on this topic, there is a question from the audience that was first posed by Serena, and then Annie Oak added to it, which is about VC money financing a growing number of for-profit companies developing psychedelic therapies. And these companies argue that they need investment capital to finance these expensive clinical trials. So the question here is wondering how each of the speakers would address that argument. And we might have just answered it with the MAPS model, but I'm wondering if anyone has anything else to say about this concept that we need the VC money to further the field.
This is exactly the kind of thing I'm worried about. So the VC comes in, they put in a ton of money in, they patent the substances, and then they have a huge amount of motivation and power to game the regulations. So you could easily end up in a situation where the only legal psychedelics you have is if you get the legal psychedelics from a pharmaceutical company and take it in the way that they want you to, right? And I think that's exactly the direction we don't want to go in. It's I have questions, really profound questions, with the idea of medicalizing psychedelics in the first place. I think that the realm of usefulness and value for psychedelics is far, far broader than therapeutics. But what my experience in the cannabis industry taught me is there's a lot of big money that's already being deployed, hundreds of millions of dollars, in an effort to keep cannabis, or the biggest part of the cannabis industry, in a medical realm. And I think that's kind of putting psychedelics into this very narrowly defined space where they will not be able to do the broader work that I think that is the object and the aim of these substances being here for us.
Let me say also, just experience in cannabis, there's been an awful lot of fraud going on in this area of here. Invest in my company. We have this new cannabis product that's going to make millions of dollars. And you check into it, and often they don't even have an FDA certified researcher working for them. I'd say the number of fraudulent cannabis companies with stock listings and even investors, ignorant investors, far outnumbers the number of legitimate ones. Now, MAPS, I think, has set a very good example of legitimate research, and there's other legitimate research also going on in psychedelics, but I worry about these people who are bombarding me with emails to please invest in their psychedelics company or whatever.
I also would love to, just on this point, just call out the North Star Initiative and the We'll Call It Paula sort of story that sort of highlights sort of the vision of what psychedelics going down this road could look like. I think that is a very, very powerful sort of piece that's been put together that imagines exactly what we're talking about. And I believe that there's a talk on just that.
Yeah, I will be, as co-founder of North Star, in that presenting later this afternoon about our work to do this. And it's part of why I'm really just thrilled to be part of this conversation here and taking my own personal lessons in the cannabis industry and thinking through the ways that we can be different moving forward. So we have about 10 more minutes left here, and there's a couple more questions from the audience. One is related to Oakland's equity permitting system. And so I would love if the panel members here could share with our audience what the purpose and intention of the equity permitting system is and how that has effectively rolled out in Oakland and what we've learned from that process.
I can take that. The purpose of the equity regulations in Oakland was simple. It's to ensure that as we build a legal cannabis industry, that those communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on cannabis have a real, meaningful opportunity to participate in the legal industry. That was the purpose. I think that the rollout has been choppy, that it has been inconsistent, that in some regards it's hurt some of the people that it was intended to help, and that as a whole, that Oakland's regulatory posture towards cannabis, equity is part of it. The outrageous taxes that they have is another part of it. Basically caused Oakland to give up its greatest economic opportunity development that it's seen in 30 years. A real tragedy. Now, the great part about it is that, people are persistent. The program continues to be worked on. It gets better over time. And the idea that equity is an important part of building this industry, that it's a critical part of it, has now spread all over the place. And so Oakland did what Oakland so frequently does. We came up with a brilliant visionary idea. We had the courage and the grit to move it forward. We got it done because we're pioneers and because we move fast and because we do stuff that nobody's done before. Sometimes the rollout is choppy. Sometimes there's unintended consequences. But look at how that idea now has spread. And yeah, just the idea that you build an industry that incorporates equity is kind of a whole new idea. And so I think that Oakland has again, really proved its value to the overall cannabis ecosystem. We've been coming up with good ideas in the city for a long time, and we still are.
Yeah, I would second that. That the lesson from equity in Oakland is not to try to copy the program exactly, but to take inspiration from the fact that it exists at all.
Great. Dale, go ahead.
I have a different perspective on the Oakland Equity Program. I thought it was a political complication that really set back Oakland's general cannabis program at the time. First of all, it was a political thing. And the initial drafts of it were written by a certain city council person who happened to be chairperson of the critical committee, and wrote it so that the equity applicants would be coming specifically from designated police wards, which happened to be in her district and the district of our fellow city council person who had generally been pretty adverse to cannabis unless it was something that went directly to his district. The result of it was, at that time, I had been sitting for the last half dozen years on a cannabis oversight panel that was established in Oakland under Measure Z. And we had all sorts of difficulty accomplishing anything. But finally, with a new help of a new mayor and certain city council people, we got to a cooperative agreement that was whereby we were able to work with the city manager, and we worked out for the first time a pretty flexible, workable system for regulating manufacture and testing and distribution, and all aspects of the industry that were coming under going to be coming under state regulation. Bingo. In comes this council person with her equity thing and completely sabotaged that effort, sidelined it, and it became complicated and balled up so that people who had been working in the city for as long as people had been operating in the city doing medical cannabis all of a sudden had to go through all these hoops to suddenly satisfy equity. The guilt was actually put on the industry for not having for having imprisoned all of these minorities who were actually imprisoned by the state, by the police, by the court system, and by the legal system. And, you know, I had I thought equity programs could be handled pretty well by an independent program of special approvals, the fee exemptions, tax exemptions, and things like that by the city, but it actually impinged on the licensing of people who had been working there for years and years. I thought it set the city back. It did set the city back, actually, as far as, so, you know, when we establish new industries, we don't have to put all these new bells and whistles on it. When people, you know, come up with a new hot stock, a new unicorn, they don't have to demonstrate their equity. They don't have to demonstrate their environmental impact or anything else other than in the course of normal regulations. So I did not think that Oakland's particular approach to the equity program was very positive.
Right, but Dale, remember that in fact there was impetus from the ground up for equity in Oakland before that certain council person seized a hold of the issue. You know, I had organized the diversity forum, Jack London Square. The Hood Incubator was active by that point. So it was really this council person seizing on something that I think already was going to happen. And yeah, the rollout was choppy, but had we not done that in Oakland, it could be possible that the larger conversation about equity in the industry wouldn't have taken place or would have taken a lot longer to take place. Right.
When I look at equity, I think that a lot of the things that I hear coming out of New York are really inspiring. And there's challenges there as well, as anybody following that story can sort of attest to. But you know, again, this is a conversation that continues to evolve, and it's in its evolution that we get to really powerful ends.
Yeah, I really like this dialogue here, and because it's for me a question which is about what is important to include as a movement. What are some of the qualities that we should be enshrining in our reform and drug policy initiatives? What have we learned from the psychedelic experiences that we can try to capture? And if we can't do it in the regulatory framework, how do we generate a culture that can highlight and lift up this movement in a way so that the way that things get rolled out is representative of the experiences themselves and the amazing transformative lessons that we get through experiencing these sacred and powerful tools?
Well, I think that that one of the ways that we do that is just ensuring that there's a diversity of voices that are present in this movement. And traditionally, most of the conversation around psychedelics and psychedelic reform in the United States has been in academic circles, has been in white circles, has been in upper middle class or elite circles. And I think that making a conscious effort to outreach to other communities that haven't had the same kind of access to information about psychedelics, some of the work that MAPS is doing with communities that have suffered trauma, for example, I think is really, really important. That I don't think that we ourselves can really fully imagine what it is that we want to be, because I don't think that we ourselves yet are the full diversity of what we need to grow into.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It was mentioned earlier on here, and I just want to reiterate that there was a comment about this panel being very white and male dominated, and that has actually been the case in the history of the cannabis policy reform movement. And so what I found interesting about equity and how it kind of came in at the end, it came in almost as an afterthought here in Oakland, was my thought was, what would have been different if those voices were included from the beginning? I don't know if anyone has a comment on that, or I can move to the next question.
I think that one thing that's come up for me with equity is that the loan amounts that have been offered to equity businesses have been really low, right? We're talking about $20,000 max. And like I said, sometimes that's your rent. Now the equity program has some of these things where like you can be incubated so that your rent is covered, things like this. But the amount of the loans, if the amount that the loan is able to offer doesn't add up to the cost that you actually need to start your business, then there's going to be a lot of situations where somebody comes in and actually walks away with less money than they started. And that is absolutely the opposite of what we're trying to achieve with an equity program.
Got it. So I was wrong about timing earlier, and now we still have 10 more minutes, which is great. And one question I wanted to ask this whole time to each of you is, what would be a piece of advice that you would give, where there's so many people who are involved in this conference, who are engaged right now with us, watching and listening and adding comments to this thread, who are advocating for decriminalizing or legalizing psychedelics. I've heard a lot of conversation today around staying hyper-local, but I'm wondering what your vision would be and what you imagine might happen for this reform movement over the next 12 months and over the next 5 years. I'd love to hear your perspectives on that and any advice for these advocates.
Well, I just on a strategic level, I think I've laid out what my preferred course forward be at this point. And I let me preface this by saying I'm just getting into the dialogue. I haven't heard a lot of the other points of view, and so I'm coming to this with some biases that largely grow out of my experience with cannabis, and these views no doubt will modify over time as I engage with the greater psychedelic community. But I think that as an initial step, passing initiatives that allow for a legal or almost legal psychedelic space to be created for individuals, but they do not mandate a legalized access to the plants, is the lowest bar, easiest thing for us to accomplish. And that's something that I could see being accomplished in many, 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 many different municipalities and eventually states around the country. Keep them nonprofit, and then those centers can do this process of education, and they will grow organically. Almost anybody would be able to put them together. They could happen in a variety of different communities. So a lot of different flavors of the psychedelic experience and teachings and learnings will have opportunity and time to blossom. And I would do that in a fairly organic process moving forward. That would be my local on the ground strategy. And then when we're talking about engaging at the federal level, and we're talking about efforts that are going to require the huge amounts of money to come to fruition, then I would like to see those structured along the same lines that MAPS has structured it, so that there is not this, what I view as a really serious danger of corruption by rampant capitalism in the psychedelic community. So on the ground, keep it organic. Don't have any mandated access. Let 1,000 different varieties bloom. Don't make it too difficult or too challenging for municipalities and states to embrace. Keep it open. And on the federal level, engage with the kind of resources that you need to be successful, but structure those organizations in such a way so that the intention remains good.
Thank you, Steve.
And I agree thoroughly with Steve pretty much on all of those points. I would add a caution. I don't start at the top necessarily. It's I know people want to do these statewide initiatives. They're very expensive, and I'm not convinced that the public support is there at the moment. I mean, we barely got by Denver with 50 and a fraction percent of the vote. Denver's a very liberal city in Colorado. But I mean, when we did medical marijuana in San Francisco and Santa Cruz, we were getting like 75 and 80% of the vote. So there isn't the same general enthusiasm. And generally, when you're doing a ballot initiative, by the way, you really want to have like 60% beforehand. And I just don't think we're there. We were there on medical marijuana when we did Prop 215. But before we did that, we had 5 years of local action. We had, local initiatives in Santa Cruz and San Francisco. We went to city councils in San Jose and San Diego and all over. And then there were actually 3 separate measures in the state legislature, a resolution followed by 2 bills that got vetoed. And when the second bill got vetoed, we said, well, this was a logical time for the people of California to come in, which was a very expensive proposition. But play your local cards and your legislative cards to the extent you can before you make that all-out push and, try to raise millions of dollars to appeal to the voters.
Thank you for that. Allan.
Yeah. So I would love to have conversations about a lot of the things that Dale and Steve just mentioned. I would love for the conversation to be more inclusive of seeing all of us as warriors in the fight to end the drug war more generally, and having that be a larger part of the conversation. I also think having more of a conversation around existing practitioners and what their role in the future of this movement and this industry is very important. I think it's so easy to get sort of locked into this idea of who owns the businesses and what is the structure of the businesses, and to be distracted away from thinking about what trainings look like and how we can one of the comments that came up yesterday that I think is so important is, there's a lot of existing practitioners that are not, psychotherapists, don't have those degrees and are not necessarily eligible for those trainings. And being really conscious about what is the place that we are creating to allow for transition, if that is what we are looking for, in diversity when appropriate, and it's always appropriate. So I think that including those and including, I think, a lot of the things that you're going to be talking about at 2:00 with the North Star Pledge.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. We have just 2 minutes, and I had just one more quick question, which is the state initiatives that are currently happening are gaining so much press and attention. And there's a lot of positive PR happening all across the field of psychedelics, a lot having to do with the advancement of research. It's been, easier to advance research in psychedelics than it has been for cannabis, which is a whole other session we could have. But I'm wondering if you think the timelines might be faster for psychedelic reform. Based on success in cannabis. And maybe you don't know. I mean, no idea? No comments here? Okay.
What's the timeline for what? I mean, I think the question.
Timeline for what? Okay, so you said that there was 5 years of local initiatives before there was a play at the state level. Do you think that that's a reasonable timeline for the work that's happening now with Decrim Nature and the desire and the push forward with Decrim California, for example?
I think 5 years is probably a good parentheses to use right now. With cannabis, it took us, I'd say that, the really serious. Well, it took us. There were 91. Dennis Perrone started with medical cannabis, really, and maybe a little bit earlier than that. And it took us all the way until 2004, arguably, to get some kind of state legislation passed that was protective. So I would say yes, 5 years, because the psychedelic movement is accelerating at a pace that I never would have imagined. Right? I've always been an advocate. I've never been involved because I wanted to protect my position with cannabis, and then this movement just roared up so quickly. It came out of nowhere. So I think it does have a big head of steam. It's moving very rapidly. But I don't think you can underestimate the amount of education that's needed for the public. I think that this is going to be initially a larger lift than cannabis was. And also the dynamic that Dale laid out. If you do local initiatives, it's a lot easier to raise the money. It's a lot easier to put the team together. It's easier to actually win them. If you can go into a campaign for a state initiative saying, hey, in the last cycle, we ran 20 local initiatives, and out of those 20 local initiatives, we won 18 of them. It's a lot easier to get donors. It's a lot easier to get endorsements. It's a lot easier. So I would say that we are in the phase now where I would be much more optimistic about local initiatives and build it towards the statewide initiative. Look, initiatives are really exciting. You do get a lot of attention. The media is talking about you. There's a huge opportunity for PR. But when they go down, when they lose, the opposite is true. It sets you back very, very significantly. When the public reject what you are putting forth, especially if they reject it by a large margin, the amount of time that you will need to make up that loss is greater than it would have if you'd put the work in patiently in the beginning in the first place.
Thank you for that. So we're finishing up here. I just want to give Allan and Dale one final chance to give one final thought or a piece of advice to the upcoming psychedelic advocates.
I'm going to say find ways to get involved, find ways to create connections with people in the cannabis movement, even if that's not your movement. We're all fighting for the same thing, which is cognitive liberty and the ability to exist in a state of freedom that is currently not allowed. And we're all in this together.
And let's have more conferences like this and continue the networking to develop a really strong movement here for psychedelic reform. I feel good about this conference.
Yeah, amazing.
Good about what MAPS is doing and what the other people here that we've heard from are doing. I think we're on the right path.
Thank you all so much. And thank you so much for the listeners and for all your questions. And yeah, just enjoy the rest of your day today. I'll be back on later on. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Allan, for all of the work that you've contributed in cannabis and all the amazing, incredible lessons that we get to now learn from your work. Thank you.
Thank you.